At the will reading, Grandpa's lawyer handed me a $42 million check. My father snatched it, lit a match, and watched it burn. I didn't protest. I just smiled. What they destroyed was actually, I'm Alex, I'm 32 years old, and my own parents had me legally declared dead to steal my inheritance. Before I tell you how I used my grandfather's last gift to expose them in a packed courtroom, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. It all started on a Tuesday, one of those gray, drizzly Tuesdays in October where the world just feels a little bit heavy. I was sitting in a lawyer's office that smelled of old books and expensive coffee. The chair was leather, probably worth more than my entire apartment, and it creaked every time I shifted my weight. The air was thick with a tension so profound it felt like a physical presence. Across the polished mahogany table sat my family, or the people who were biologically related to me. My father, Richard, sat ramrod straight, his perfectly tailored suit a kind of armor. His face, which I inherited in fragments, was a mask of bored impatience. Beside him, my mother, Eleanor, her pearls gleaming against her black dress, her posture impeccable. She radiated a chillingly serene disapproval. And my sister, Emma, a little younger than me, was utterly absorbed in her phone, her thumb flicking endlessly upwards. She had perfected the art of being present and absent at the same time. We were there for the reading of my grandfather's will. Arthur Sterling. His name alone carried weight in this city. He was the only one who ever really saw me, the only one who looked past the Sterling name and saw the boy who liked to draw in the margins of his notebooks. He was the patriarch, the man who built the Sterling and Son Holdings empire from nothing. I hadn't wanted to come. 13 years of silence and a carefully curated absence had been my shield. Being in this room felt like tearing off a scar. But I had made a promise to Grandpa on one of his last good days. "You be there, Alex," he'd rasped, his hand, thin and papery, gripping mine with surprising strength. "Promise me, you have to be there." So I was a ghost at the feast. The lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in her 50s named Sylvia Orton, finally cleared her throat, bringing the silent room to attention. She had a no-nonsense air about her that I appreciated. She began reading through the usual bequests in a calm, measured tone. A vintage Patek Philippe watch to my father, who glanced at his own Rolex as if comparing them. A collection of first-edition novels to my mother, who would undoubtedly display them but never read them. To Emma, the family's sprawling vacation cabin on the lake and a vintage Martin guitar she'd once coveted. My family nodded along, their faces masks of practiced solemnity. This was all going according to their script. Then Sylvia paused. The rustling of paper stopped. She looked up from the document, and her eyes, sharp and intelligent, found mine across the table. She held my gaze for a beat too long, a silent message passing between us that I didn't yet understand. "And finally," she said, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the stale air, "to my beloved grandson Alexander Sterling, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including all controlling shares in Sterling and Son Holdings, valued at $42 million. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air out of the room. My mother's hand flew to her pearls, a gesture of shock that was, for once, completely genuine. Emma's head snapped up from her phone, her mouth slightly agape. My father just stared. The mask of bored authority shattered, and his face cycled through a Rolodex of emotions. Disbelief, confusion, and then a deep, dangerous, blotchy red. That's impossible," he sputtered, his voice a strangled whisper. "It's a mistake." Sylvia didn't flinch. "The document is ironclad, Richard." She reached into a folder and pulled out a cashier's check, sliding it across the polished table toward me. My name was printed on it in bold, black ink. Alexander Sterling, $42 million. The numbers seemed to float off the page, unreal. I didn't move, couldn't. I was paralyzed by the sheer gravitational pull of the moment. But my father could move. He shot out of his chair so fast it screeched against the floorboards, a sound of pure rage. He lunged across the table, his cufflinks scratching the perfect mahogany, and snatched the check before my fingers could even graze it. Then he did something I will never, ever forget. He pulled a gold-plated lighter from his pocket, the one Grandpa had given him for his 40th birthday, flicked it on, and held the flame to the corner of the $42 million check. The corner blackened, curled, and caught. The flame greedily ate its way across the paper, turning my name, my future, into a fragile, glowing ember. My mother, in a synchronized act of vicious destruction, grabbed the thick envelope next to it, the final letter from my grandfather, and began tearing it into tiny, furious pieces, letting them flutter onto the table like bitter confetti. They both looked at me then, their eyes blazing with a unified, triumphant hatred. They were waiting for me to scream, to cry, to lunge at them as he had lunged for the check. They wanted a reaction. They wanted to see me break. But I didn't. I just sat there, watching the last physical proof of my inheritance turn to smoke, and I smiled. A small, quiet, knowing smile, because Grandpa had told me this would happen. He knew his son. He knew his family. And this bonfire on a lawyer's desk was only the opening act. What they thought was their final victory was just the beginning of their end. To understand that smile, you have to understand the 13 years of silence that came before it. You have to go back to a dinner table that felt less like a family gathering and more like a corporate boardroom where I was the failing investment, about to be liquidated. I was 19, a sophomore in business school, dutifully walking the path my father had paved for me before I could even spell balance sheet. The Son in Sterling and Son. It was my birthright, my destiny, my cage. Every lecture on market analysis and corporate synergy felt like a shovelful of dirt on a coffin. The only time I felt alive, truly myself, was late at night, in the quiet of my dorm room, with the scent of charcoal on my fingers and a blank canvas that held more promise than any stock portfolio. Art was my secret, my rebellion, my air. One night, I decided I couldn't suffocate anymore. It was during a family dinner, one of those stiff, formal affairs at the mansion. The clinking of heavy silver against porcelain was the only sound, a metronome counting down to nothing. I put my fork down. The small sound was like a gunshot in the silence. "Dad, Mom," I said, my voice shaking just enough to betray my terror. "I have something to tell you." My father looked up from his perfectly cooked steak, annoyed at the unscheduled interruption. "What is it, Alexander? Don't mumble. I'm leaving business school." The clinking stopped. My mother froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips. Emma, as always, kept her eyes on her plate, a master of non-involvement. "You're what?" my father said, his voice dangerously low, the kind he used right before firing someone. "I'm going to art school," I blurted out, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I've been accepted into the Pratt Institute. I want to be a painter." If I had announced I was joining a traveling circus, their reaction might have been better. My father's face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and sheer disgust. "A painter?" He said the word like it was something foul he'd scraped off the bottom of his shoe. "A Sterling does not become a painter. We build things. We create empires. We don't doodle." "It's not doodling, Dad. It's my passion. It's who I am." "Who you are," he scoffed, throwing his linen napkin on the table, "is a disappointment. You're throwing your life away. You're throwing our legacy away. Everything I have built, everything my father built, for you to finger paint." My mother finally spoke, her voice thin and sharp as a shard of ice. "Think of the family, Alexander. The embarrassment. What will people say when they find out a Sterling is a starving artist?" "I don't care what people say," I pleaded, my eyes darting between their cold, unforgiving faces. "This is my life." That was the wrong thing to say. My father stood up, his chair scraping back violently. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his whole body rigid with rage. "Fine. You want that life? You can have it. But you'll have it alone. As of this moment, you are no longer my son." I came back to the house a week later to get my things, naively thinking he was just being dramatic. My key didn't work. When I rang the bell, the maid, a kind woman who had known me since I was a baby, let me in with eyes full of pity. My room, it was gone, stripped bare. The band posters, the shelves of books, my old drawing pads. All of it had vanished. The walls were painted a sterile, unforgiving white. It was as if I had never existed. They hadn't just disowned me. They had methodically, clinically erased me. That was the beginning of the long, cold winter. My bank account, funded by a family trust, was suddenly empty. My credit cards were declined. My calls to the house went to a disconnected tone. I sent Emma a text on Thanksgiving, a desperate, simple, happy Thanksgiving. I miss you guys. A day later, she replied, Mom and Dad said it's better if we don't talk for a while. It's just too hard for them right now. I knew then that I had lost her too. She had chosen comfort over loyalty. At 19, I was completely, terrifyingly alone. I got a job washing dishes at a greasy spoon diner that always smelled of stale coffee and regret. I found a tiny, roach-infested apartment above a laundromat where the machines rumbled at all hours like a restless giant. The clatter of cheap plates and the sharp scent of industrial bleach became the soundtrack to my life. But every night, after my exhausting 12-hour shift, I would come home, my body aching, and I would paint. I painted my anger, my loneliness, my grief. I painted because if I stopped, I was afraid I would actually disappear. The only lifeline I had came in plain, unassuming envelopes. About once a month, a letter would appear in my cramped mailbox. No return address, just my name and address written in a familiar, elegant script that was a world away from my grimy reality. It was from my grandfather. The first one arrived about 3 months into my exile. Inside was a crisp $200 bill and a short handwritten note on his heavy, cream-colored stationery. Alex, it read, your father is a proud man, too proud. He sees the world in black and white, profit and loss. Don't let his pride dim your light. I saw the drawings you used to hide under your bed. You have a gift, a real one. Use it. Those letters became my gospel. He never mentioned my parents. He never tried to broker a peace treaty. He just saw me. He wrote about the stubborn woodpecker that visited his window, a book he was reading, a memory of me as a child trying to build a sandcastle against the tide. And in every letter there was cash. Just enough to buy canvases and paint, to pay for a utility bill, to keep me from going under completely. It wasn't charity. It was fuel. I remember a particularly brutal winter. The diner had cut my hours, and I was selling my paintings on the street for 10 or 20 bucks a piece. My fingers numb inside my threadbare gloves. I was close to giving up, to swallowing my pride and crawling back. That afternoon, an envelope was waiting. Inside, he'd written, I once saw your father in a negotiation. He was ruthless, brilliant. He saw a weakness and exploited it. That is his strength. But you, Alex, you see beauty where others see nothing. You see potential in a blank canvas. That is your strength. It is a rarer and more valuable thing. Do not ever mistake your strength for a weakness. He had enclosed $500. He was teaching me, from a distance, to value myself in a currency my father would never understand. A few years later, I was having a small show at a local coffee shop, my first ever real exhibition. I wanted to invite him. I knew I couldn't walk up to the front door of the Sterling mansion. So I went around the back, hoping to catch one of the staff. That's when I saw Mrs. Gable, the family's housekeeper, tending to my grandmother's old rose bushes. She saw me and her eyes went wide with a mixture of fear and affection. Master Alexander, she whispered, looking over her shoulder toward the house. It's just Alex, Mrs. Gable, I said, giving her a small smile. Is he in? She wrung her hands in her apron. Your father gave strict orders, Alex. I would lose my job. I know, I said, my heart sinking. I wouldn't ask you to do that. Could you give him this for me? I held out a small, handmade invitation. Her eyes softened. She took the invitation and tucked it into her pocket. Then, she quickly pulled a thick envelope from another pocket. He told me you might come by. He has a sense for these things. He said to give you this. I took the envelope. It was heavy. Inside was a longer letter and a key. Cold, old-fashioned, safe deposit box key. Alex, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means I am either gone, or things have become difficult. I have watched my son become a man I no longer recognize. A man consumed by the very things I warned him against, greed and control. I fear what he might do when I am gone, when he believes no one is watching. This key is for your protection. The box is in your name. Do not open it unless you have to. Trust Sylvia Orton. Her number is in here. She is a good woman. She knows my wishes. And then he wrote the line that would become my mantra, the words that would see me through the darkest nights. They can take your room, they can take your name off the company letterhead, they can even take your money. But your talent, your character, your soul, that is yours alone. Make something they can never erase. That letter was a shield. I put the key and the note in a safe place and tried to live by his words. I focused on my art. Slowly, painfully, I started to build a life. It wasn't the life my parents had planned, but it was mine. I never saw my grandfather again. His health declined, and my father used it as an excuse to keep him isolated. I respected his privacy, living off the memory of his words and the secret strength he'd given me. Then, 2 months ago, I got the call from Sylvia Orton. He was gone, and he had requested specifically that I be at the will reading. So now, as I sat there in that suffocatingly expensive office, watching my father burn away my future and my mother shred my past, I wasn't just some disowned, pathetic artist. I was my grandfather's grandson. I was the keeper of his last secret, the final move in a chess game he had been playing for years. I left the office without another word. The smoke from the check still hung in the air, a bitter perfume of their hatred. My father was shouting something at Sylvia about contesting the will, calling it coercion of a senile old man. I didn't listen. I walked out into the drizzling rain, the city lights blurring around me. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and looked at the contact I had saved years ago, the one I had never used until today. Sylvia Orton. I pressed call. It was time to open the box. It was time to remind them that I existed. The law office of Sylvia Orton, when I visited the next day, was a world away from the sterile, intimidating conference room where my inheritance had gone up in smoke. Her personal office was smaller, cozier, a controlled chaos of overflowing bookshelves, teetering stacks of legal files, and vibrant, abstract art that I recognized and admired. It was the space of a person who valued substance over style, and it immediately put me at ease. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice calm and steady as she gestured to a chair. "You look like you haven't slept. Is it that obvious?" I said, sinking into the chair. My own voice was hoarse. My mind had been a frantic highlight reel all night. The check curling into ash. My father's face illuminated by the flame. A mask of pure, triumphant rage. She handed me a heavy ceramic mug that felt warm and solid in my hands. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man, Alex. He was also a brilliant strategist who knew his opponent inside and out." I took a sip of the hot coffee, letting it burn away some of the chill that had settled deep in my bones. "He knew, didn't he? He knew they would do that." "He knew," she confirmed, sitting behind her large wooden desk, which, unlike my father's, was covered in actual work. "He hoped he was wrong, but he never let hope cloud his judgment. The check your father burned? A decoy, a bank-certified copy, completely worthless for cashing purposes. The letter your mother destroyed? Also a copy. The originals are in a vault, safe and sound." A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. It wasn't gone. He hadn't let them destroy it. The old man had seen it all coming. "He called it the Dragon's Gambit," Sylvia continued with a wry smile. "He knew your father couldn't resist a grand, dramatic gesture of dominance. He wanted him to reveal his true nature on the record in front of a legal witness. Me." I shook my head, a slow, dawning sense of awe replacing the fear. "A test. The whole thing was a test. And your family failed spectacularly," she said. Her smile faded, and her expression turned serious, pulling the warmth from the room. But Alex, that's not the worst of it. That was just the part your grandfather could predict. What they did next, that's something else entirely. It's colder, more calculated. She took a breath. Your grandfather's letter, the real one, instructed you to come here. It also contained a directive for me to do a full, deep-dive background check on your legal status the moment he passed away. My legal status? I asked, confused. What does that mean? I have a driver's license, I pay my taxes, I exist. Sylvia leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk, her gaze direct and unflinching. Alex, there's no easy way to say this. According to the official records of this state, 5 years ago, your parents initiated a legal process. A process that concluded 6 months ago. She paused, letting the weight of her words gather. They had you legally declared dead. Dead. The word hung in the air between us. It didn't compute. It was like a word from a foreign language that had no translation. I don't understand. How is that even possible? It's a niche part of probate law, she began to explain, her voice taking on a clinical tone, as if to shield me from the emotional horror of it. It's called a declaration of death in absentia. It's meant for situations like a soldier lost at war or a sailor lost at sea. It requires a sustained period of absence and a credible reason to believe the person is deceased. But I wasn't lost at sea. My voice cracked. I was here, in this city. They created a narrative, she said, her own voice tight with anger. They hired a rather unscrupulous private investigator and an equally unscrupulous lawyer. They fabricated evidence. Emails from you talking about a solo, off-the-grid backpacking trip through a remote, dangerous part of the Amazon rainforest. A forged letter to your sister, saying goodbye and that you were seeking a place where the modern world couldn't find you. They even filed a phony missing persons report, then told the police you were a troubled adult and not to pursue it actively. My blood ran cold. I remembered that period 5 years ago. I'd been working 2 jobs, saving up for a down payment on a better apartment. I had been so focused, so exhausted, I barely spoke to anyone for months. They had used my struggle, my isolation against me. They waited out the statutory period, Sylvia finished, which is 5 years in this state if there's evidence of peril. Then, 6 months ago, they went back to court with their proof and a heavy heart. The judge, seeing a grieving family and a stack of evidence, signed the order. As far as the law is concerned, Alexander Sterling died in the Amazon. The coffee mug trembled in my hand. I set it down before I dropped it. The room felt like it was closing in, the vibrant paintings on the wall suddenly looking like angry, chaotic slashes of color. Couldn't breathe. My throat was tight. My chest felt like a band of steel was crushing it. This was a betrayal so profound, so monstrous, it was hard to comprehend. It wasn't about the money. It was never just about the money. It was about nullification, annihilation. They didn't just want me out of the way. They wanted me gone, wiped from the slate of existence, a ghost with no name and no rights. I put my head in my hands, the rough texture of my calloused fingers a strange, grounding sensation against my skin. So, what happens now? I whispered, the words barely audible. Am I a ghost? Do I just cease to exist because a piece of paper says so? For a long, terrifying moment, a dark, tempting thought slithered into the back of my mind. I could just disappear. It's what they wanted. Take what little I had, change my name, and go somewhere they'd never find me. Let them have the damn money. Let them have their rotten, empty victory. What was the point of fighting a war against people who had already buried you? I left Sylvia's office in a daze. I walked for hours, the city's noise a dull roar in my ears. I saw people laughing in cafes, rushing to meetings, living their lives, and I felt utterly disconnected from them, as if I were watching them through a pane of glass. I was a ghost haunting the streets of my own city. I found myself in front of a small gallery, one that had rejected my work years ago. I looked at my own reflection in the darkened window, a man in a worn jacket with tired eyes. Did he look dead? The thought was so absurd, it broke the spell. A flicker of anger, cold and hard as diamond, cut through the fog of my despair. No, I was not dead. I was standing right here. I turned and walked, with purpose now, all the way back to Sylvia's building. It was late, but the light in her office was still on. She opened the door before I could knock. "I was hoping you'd be back," she said softly. "I'm not a ghost," I said, my voice firm for the first time. "No," she agreed. "You are not. You are sitting right here in my office. You are alive. And you are the sole heir to Arthur Sterling's estate." She reached across the desk and pushed a small, brass key toward me. The key. The one my grandfather had given me all those years ago. A promise sealed in a now tattered envelope. "Your grandfather knew this was a possibility," she said. "He told me, if my son is foolish enough to burn a fake check, he might be monstrous enough to do something far worse. The safe deposit box, Alex. It's time." I picked up the key. It was heavy in my hand, a solid, tangible piece of reality. "I remember something," I said, my mind racing, piecing things together. In his last letter, the one with the key, Grandpa mentioned a memory box he kept. He said he kept all the real treasures in it. I always thought he meant old photos, things from Grandma. I stood up, the chair creaking in protest. "I think we need to go to his library. I think we need to go now." The decision was made. The moment of weakness had passed. This was no longer just a legal battle to claim an inheritance. This was a fight for my life. A fight to prove I was real. I would stand on my own 2 feet, walk back into the world they tried to kick me out of, and I would scream my name until they heard it in their soulless, gilded cages. My name is Alexander Sterling, and I am alive, and I was coming for them. The Sterling mansion felt different this time. Before, it had been a symbol of my rejection, a cold stone monument to a life I wasn't allowed to have. Now it was a battleground, a trove of secrets I was here to claim. Sylvia's presence beside me was a shield of legitimacy I'd never felt before. We were met at the door by a stony-faced Emma, who looked like she'd been waiting for us. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her arms crossed, blocking the doorway. She wasn't looking at me, but at Sylvia, as if I were merely my lawyer's shadow. "We have an appointment to review some of your grandfather's personal effects, as stipulated in the will," Sylvia said smoothly, holding up a document that shimmered with legal authority. Emma's eyes flickered to me, and for a second, I saw not just resentment, but fear. "You have no right." "On the contrary," Sylvia replied, her voice as cool and sharp as a scalpel. "My client has every right. Now, if you'll excuse us." She moved past Emma without waiting for an answer, a clear signal that the old power dynamics were dead and buried. I followed in her wake, my heart hammering. The house was just as I remembered it. Cavernous, silent, and cold, like a museum where the exhibits were priceless but the air was unbreathable. We walked down the long, echoing hall to the library. The rich scent of leather-bound books, beeswax, and old wood hit me, a smell so deeply tied to my grandfather that it felt like he was still in the room watching. The library was his sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, a testament to a life of reading and learning. A large, unlit fireplace dominated one wall, a masterful portrait of my smiling grandmother hanging above it. "A memory box," Sylvia said, scanning the thousands of books. "Your grandfather was a romantic, but he was also frustratingly vague." I closed my eyes, trying to transport myself back in time. I was a kid again, maybe 8 years old, sitting on the plush Aubusson rug while Grandpa read to me. He'd pull books from the shelves, his long, elegant fingers tracing the embossed gold spines. What was it he always used to say? My eyes snapped open. "He had a favorite book," I said, a jolt of adrenaline running through me. "It was The Count of Monte Cristo. He gave me a copy when I was 14. He said it was the best revenge story ever written. A story about a man who was wrongfully imprisoned and stripped of everything, only to return with a new identity to reclaim his life." The parallel was so stark it took my breath away. I walked over to the section on classic literature. My fingers, stained with a faint trace of ultramarine blue paint, skimmed the spines. Dumas. There it was. A beautiful, well-worn, leather-bound edition. It looked just like the others, but as I touched it, I felt it was different. Heavier. More solid. I pulled it from the shelf. It wasn't a book. It was a box hollowed out to look like one. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at Sylvia, and she gave me a sharp, encouraging nod. I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, wasn't the safe deposit key. It was a single, intricately folded piece of paper. An origami bird. My grandfather and I used to make them when I was little, a fleet of paper creatures on rainy afternoons. "What is it?" Sylvia asked, peering over my shoulder. "A memory," I said softly. I carefully unfolded the bird. Written inside, in my grandfather's familiar, elegant script, was a short riddle. "Where knowledge rests, but has no spine, and history is told without a single line. Look behind the face of my one true queen, and you will find what must remain unseen." I read it aloud, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. Sylvia frowned in concentration. "Knowledge rests but has no spine. Not a book, then. History is told without a single line. Not a manuscript." My gaze drifted around the room, past the globe, the antique desk, and landed on the fireplace. On the portrait of my grandmother, her kind eyes seeming to smile right at me. "The face of my one true queen," I whispered. I walked over to the fireplace, my footsteps muffled by the thick rug. The portrait was huge, enclosed in a heavy, ornate gold frame. I reached up and carefully ran my fingers along the back edge of the frame, feeling for anything out of place. My fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible indentation in the wood. A knot, maybe? Pushed it. There was a soft, satisfying click. A section of the carved wooden paneling beside the fireplace popped open, revealing a small, dark cavity, a hidden wall safe, and there, sitting on a small shelf inside, was a heavy, old-fashioned, cast-iron key. The real key to the safe deposit box. Sylvia let out a low whistle. "He really didn't make it easy. He wanted to be sure it was me," I said, gripping the cold, heavy key. "Only I would have known about his favorite book. Only I would have known who his queen was." It was a final test of love and memory. The trip to the downtown bank was a blur of nervous energy. We were ushered into a private, sterile viewing room with gray walls and a single table. A bank employee brought in the long metal box. He slid it into the opening in the wall, turned a key in tandem with his own, and left, closing the door softly behind him. The sound of the lock clicking shut sealed us in with the past. My hands were trembling as I put the iron key into the lock on the box. Turned smoothly, I lifted the heavy lid. The contents were meticulously, almost lovingly organized. On top was a thick, leather-bound journal. Beneath it, a stack of official-looking documents held together by a thick rubber band. And at the very bottom, a small, black object. A digital video camera no bigger than my palm. I picked up the journal first, its familiar weight a comfort. I opened it to a page bookmarked with a faded silk ribbon. The entry was dated about a year ago. "Richard was here today," it read. He was talking about the company's future, but his eyes kept drifting to my stock portfolio on the computer screen. "He sees me not as his father, but as an obstacle." He asked about Alex. I told him I still hear from him occasionally, that he's well. Richard's face tightened. "The boy made his choice," he said, his voice cold. "He's as good as dead to this family." The words chilled me to the bone. I see now the depths of his greed. It's a sickness. I will not let him steal Alex's birthright. I will not let him erase my grandson. I bought a small, motion-activated camera today. I will keep it hidden in my study. Paranoia, perhaps. But as they say, it's not paranoia if they're really out to get you. My hands shook as I put the journal down. This was it. The proof. The motivation. Everything. Sylvia picked up the camera. "Let's see what he recorded." She pressed the play button. The small screen flickered to life. The view was from a high corner in the library, a wide-angle shot looking down at my grandfather's desk. The date and time were stamped in the corner. The first clip showed my father, Richard, pacing back and forth, talking on the phone in hushed, urgent tones. The audio was faint, but his words were clear enough. The lawyer said 5 years is the statutory minimum. We just need to wait it out. No one will look for him. My stomach turned over. But the next clip, dated a few months later, was the one that sealed their fate. The camera was focused tightly on the desk. My father was sitting there, alone. In front of him was a piece of paper, a blank check from one of my grandfather's accounts, and a document with my signature on it from years ago, probably an old-school permission slip. For nearly 10 minutes, the camera recorded as my father, Richard Sterling, CEO and pillar of the community, painstakingly, meticulously, practiced forging my signature. Over and over again. His brow was furrowed in concentration, like a student cramming for an exam. It was cold, calculated, and utterly damning. "We've got them," Sylvia whispered, her voice filled with a quiet, furious intensity. "We've got them cold, Alex." I looked at the small screen, at the image of the man who was my father meticulously plotting my financial and legal demise. The last vestiges of any childish hope for reconciliation, for a simple misunderstanding, died in that sterile bank room. I closed the lid of the box. "What's our next move?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly steady. "Our next move," Sylvia said, a grim, determined smile on her face, "is we let them think they've won. We let them get comfortable living with their lies. And then we take them to court and we burn their world to the ground with the one thing they can't fight. The truth." The courtroom was exactly as I'd imagined. Imposing, formal, and smelling faintly of floor polish and institutional anxiety. It was packed. The story of the Sterling family feud, the ghost son returning to claim his fortune, had become a juicy piece of local gossip. I could feel the eyes on me, a mixture of pity, suspicion, and morbid curiosity. At the opposing table, my parents and Emma sat looking confident, almost smug. They were flanked by a team of expensive lawyers, led by a slick man with silver hair named Mr. Davies. They had the ultimate trump card, after all. A death certificate. "My death certificate," Davies began, his voice smooth and persuasive. He laid out their case with the practiced ease of a man who charges $1,000 an hour. He spoke of the family's profound grief, their desperate, multi-year search for their long-lost, troubled son. He presented the fabricated emails, the falsified travel itinerary for my doomed trip to South America. He painted a picture of a reckless young man who had courted danger and vanished, and a loving family who had no choice but to finally accept the tragic reality and move on. Finally, with a somber flourish, he presented the court-issued declaration of death to the judge. "Your Honor," Davies concluded, gesturing dramatically toward my parents, "this is a family that has suffered an unimaginable loss. The attempts by this claimant," he said the word with dripping contempt, his eyes flicking over me, "to impersonate their deceased son and fraudulently claim an inheritance is not only a legal matter, it is an act of profound and twisted cruelty." I could feel the tide of opinion in the room turning against me. The whispers grew louder. The doubt was a palpable thing. For a moment, I felt like an imposter in my own life, a con man trying to steal a dead person's identity. Then Sylvia stood up. She was the picture of calm, controlled energy. "Mr. Sterling," she began, addressing my father, who adopted a look of pained sorrow, "you portray yourself as a grieving father. That must have been a difficult time for you, when your son vanished." "It was the worst period of our lives," my father said, his voice thick with an actor's emotion. My mother, on cue, dabbed a dry eye with a silk handkerchief. "So difficult, in fact," Sylvia continued, her voice sharpening just a fraction, "that you couldn't even wait for his body to be found before you had him declared dead, an action that conveniently made you the primary beneficiary of your own father's considerable fortune." Davies shot to his feet. "Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness and making baseless accusations." "Sustained," the judge said, a weary look on his face. Get to the point, Ms. Orton. Of course, Your Honor, Sylvia said. My point is about the nature of truth, and the incredible lengths people will go to conceal it. She turned her attention away from my father. The prosecution calls Mrs. Helen Gable to the stand. A murmur went through the room. I saw my parents exchange a flicker of a nervous glance. Mrs. Gable, looking small and terrified but resolute in a simple gray dress, walked to the witness stand and was sworn in. Mrs. Gable, Sylvia asked gently, her voice softening to put the older woman at ease. You worked for the Sterling family for over 30 years, correct? Yes, ma'am, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Since Alex was just a little boy. Did you ever overhear Mr. and Mrs. Sterling discussing their son, Alexander, after he left the house? Yes, all the time. And what was the nature of these conversations? Mrs. Gable took a deep breath, clutching the wooden rail of the witness box. After Master Arthur's health got bad, they were planning. They were always talking about how to solve the Alex problem. I heard Mr. Sterling say that the will was a potential disaster, and that he would have to take matters into his own hands to protect the family legacy. My father's face was turning that familiar shade of deep, blotchy red. She's lying. The old woman is senile. She's a disgruntled employee. Silence, Mr. Sterling, the judge commanded, banging his gavel with a loud crack. One more outburst like that and I'll have you removed. Sylvia waited for the room to settle, unperturbed. And did you ever see anything unusual in Mr. Sterling's study, Mrs. Gable? Yes, Mrs. Gable whispered, her eyes filling with tears. I was dusting one afternoon. I saw him practicing, writing Alexander's name over and over, on napkins, on scrap paper, on the back of envelopes. I didn't understand why, but it scared me. It didn't feel right. Thank you, Mrs. Gable. No further questions, Sylvia said, turning to the judge. Your Honor, the defense would now like to present Exhibit A. The lights in the courtroom dimmed slightly, and a large screen descended from the ceiling, humming softly. What is the meaning of this? Davies protested, looking genuinely confused. This was not part of his script. This, Mr. Davies, Sylvia said, her voice ringing through the silent room, is what is sometimes referred to as a home movie. The screen flickered to life. It was the footage from the library. My father's face, projected 10 feet high for the whole world to see. There he was, at his own father's desk, painstakingly, obsessively, forging my signature. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. It was so quiet you could hear the soft whir of the projector. My mother looked like she was going to be physically sick. Emma had her hands clamped over her mouth, her face as white as a sheet. My father was frozen, a statue of guilt, his mouth hanging open in silent, slack-jawed horror as he watched his crime play out in high definition. And now, Exhibit B, Sylvia announced into the stunned silence. The forgery video was replaced by the image of my grandfather. He sat in his favorite wingback armchair, looking frail, yes, but his eyes were filled with a clear, undeniable fire. He looked directly into the camera, as if he was speaking to everyone in this room, across time. If you are watching this, his voice, raspy but strong, filled the courtroom. It means my son, Richard, has done the unthinkable. He has let greed consume him to the point of utter moral bankruptcy. I love my son, but I do not trust him. I have watched him value profit over people, reputation over integrity, and I cannot, in good conscience, leave my life's work in his hands. He paused, taking a slow breath. My grandson, Alexander, is a good man, a man of talent and integrity. He chose a path of passion over a path of profit, and for that, his father punished him, disowned him, tried to break him. But he did not break. This fortune is not a reward. It is a tool. It is the means for Alex to live the life he has earned, free from the control of those who would see him erased. He is my true heir. He is my legacy. The rest is just business. The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and damning. Then, my mother let out a strangled sob that was ugly and real. Sylvia Orton walked back to our table and placed the original, untorn letter from my grandfather in front of me. Then she turned to face the judge, her posture radiating righteous indignation. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking with controlled fury. "The defense has presented a fraudulent death certificate for a man who is very much alive. They have committed perjury. They have committed conspiracy to commit fraud. We have a video of the forgery. We have a witness to their intent. And we have the video testimony of the deceased, a man of unimpeachable character, telling us exactly who his son is. We ask that the court not only dismiss their claims in their entirety, but recognize my client, Alexander Sterling, as the sole and rightful heir, and launch a full criminal investigation into the actions of Richard and Eleanor Sterling." The judge, a man who had likely seen everything, looked down from his bench. His face was a mask of cold fury. He looked at my parents, who both refused to meet his gaze. He looked at their high-priced lawyer, who was shuffling his papers, avoiding eye contact. Then he looked at me. He picked up his gavel. He didn't just tap it. He slammed it down, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot, a final, definitive judgment. "This court finds in favor of the claimant, Alexander Sterling," he boomed, his voice resonating with authority. "The declaration of death issued by this state is hereby nullified, effective immediately. All assets of Richard and Eleanor Sterling are to be frozen, pending a full criminal investigation by the district attorney's office. This court is adjourned." It was over. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters were shouting questions. My father sat there, a broken, hollowed-out man, staring into nothing. My mother was weeping uncontrollably into her hands. And me? I just sat there, my hand resting on my grandfather's letter. And for the first time in 13 years, I felt the heavy, suffocating weight I had been carrying on my shoulders finally, blessedly, lift. I was free. I was real. And my world, which had been so dark for so long, was suddenly, blindingly, full of light. The hours after the verdict were a chaotic blur. My phone, which for 13 years had been a device for little more than checking the time, blew up with a relentless barrage of calls and texts from numbers I didn't recognize. News alerts flashed across the screen with sensational headlines: "Sterling heir alive," "Society scandal," "Parents forge son's death to steal fortune." It was surreal. I felt like I was reading about a character in a particularly trashy novel, not my own life. Sylvia, ever the strategist, navigated us through a back exit of the courthouse, shielding me from the swarm of reporters and their flashing cameras. We escaped to a quiet, old-school diner a few blocks away, a haven of worn vinyl booths and coffee that had been brewing a little too long. It was blessedly normal. "You were amazing in there," I told her, my hands wrapped around a thick ceramic mug of black coffee. They were still shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash. She gave me a tired but deeply satisfied smile. "Your grandfather was amazing. He loaded the gun and handed it to us. We just had to pull the trigger." She stirred her own coffee, her gaze distant for a moment. "You know, in all our meetings, he talked about you constantly. Not just the situation, but you. He was so proud of the man you'd become, all on your own, without the Sterling name or money to prop you up. He said you had true grit." Hearing that, right then, meant more than the $42 million. It was the validation I had craved my whole life, not from my father, but from the man whose opinion was the only one that ever truly mattered. We sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the comforting clatter of the diner filling the space between us. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about the next legal move, the next piece of evidence, or the next lie I had to unravel. I was just breathing. The war was over. I had won. But it felt less like a triumphant victory and more like the end of a long, painful illness. You don't celebrate being cured. You just feel a profound sense of gratitude for the simple act of being able to breathe without pain. My hard-won peace was interrupted a few days later. I was in the small, cluttered apartment that had been my sanctuary for years, surrounded by half-finished canvases and the familiar, sharp smell of turpentine. There was a knock on the door. A hesitant, uncertain knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it to find my sister, Emma, standing in the dingy hallway. She looked diminished. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a plain gray sweater. Her makeup was smeared, her eyes red and puffy. She looked like a ship that had lost its anchor. "Alex," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, my hand on the doorknob, my body a silent barrier. Can I come in?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the floor. I thought about it for a long moment, then stepped aside with a sigh. She walked into my small living space, her eyes scanning the paintings that leaned against every wall. It was the first time she had ever set foot in my world. "Wow," she said softly, her voice filled with a surprise that felt insulting. You're really good." As if it were a shocking revelation that my life's passion wasn't a complete waste. "What do you want, Emma?" I asked, my voice flat. The anger I had held for her for so long had burned out, leaving only a cold, gray ash of indifference. She turned to face me, and the tears welled up on cue. "I'm so sorry, Alex. I swear I didn't know about the death certificate thing. That was all them. I thought they were just contesting the will. I never would have gone along with that. It's monstrous." I listened, my expression unreadable. I had spent years dreaming of this moment, of an apology, of some sign of remorse. But now that it was here, it felt hollow, rehearsed. "I miss you," she continued, taking a hesitant step closer, as if approaching a wary animal. "I miss my brother. I want us to be a family again. What they did was wrong, I know that, but they're still our parents." As she spoke, a memory surfaced, unbidden. I was 12 and I had built an elaborate model rocket for a science fair. I was so proud of it. My father had called it a frivolous distraction. The day before the fair, Emma, trying to get my father's attention, had accidentally knocked it off a table, shattering it. She had burst into tears, not because she'd broken my rocket, but because my father was now angry at her for making a mess. She never said she was sorry to me. She only cared about getting back in his good graces. She was still doing it. "They're going to lose everything, Alex," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "The lawyers are saying it's bad. Their assets are frozen. The house, their friends are abandoning them. You have to help them. You have to do something." And there it was. The real reason she was standing in my paint-splattered apartment. It wasn't about me. It wasn't about remorse. It was about the money. It was about protecting her lifestyle, her inheritance, her comfort. The vacation cabin, the vintage guitar, all of it was tied up in the frozen assets. She wasn't sorry for what they did. She was sorry they got caught. She was just like them, only weaker. I looked at her, my sister, and I felt nothing but a profound, bottomless pity. She was as trapped by their greed as I had been, just in a prettier, more comfortable cage. I walked over to a small desk piled high with sketchbooks and picked up a piece of paper. It was a document Sylvia had drawn up that morning, a legal quitclaim deed, transferring the title of the lake cabin and its contents to Emma, free and clear. It was the one piece of the will that was undisputed, a direct gift from Grandpa. I had already signed it. I held it out to her. "Here," I said. "This is yours. It's what Grandpa wanted you to have." She took it, her eyes scanning the document quickly. A flicker of raw, undisguised relief washed over her face. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the paper like a lifeline. "That's all there is, Emma?" I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "You wanted to know what I'm going to do about Mom and Dad? The answer is nothing. Their choices are their own. Their consequences are their own. They built their world, and they can live in its ruins." I opened the door to my apartment. "I hope you have a good life, Emma. Truly." She looked from the paper in her hand to my face, searching for something. A crack in the wall, a sign of weakness she could exploit. She found nothing. She knew finally that the door was closed. She walked out without another word. I closed the door, the soft click of the lock echoing in the small room. It was the sound of a final, clean break. I had closed the door on the last chapter of my old life. I looked around at my paintings, at the beautiful, messy, chaotic world I had built for myself out of nothing but grit and paint. It was all mine, and it was time to build something new. 18 months. That's how long it took for the legal and emotional dust to finally settle. 18 months of court proceedings for my parents, public apologies I never read, and the slow, quiet, methodical process of untangling my life from the wreckage of theirs. My parents avoided jail time. Their age, a team of high-priced lawyers, and a plea bargain saw to that. But they paid hefty fines, were sentenced to a humiliating amount of community service, and lost something far more valuable to them than money: their reputation. The sterling name was now synonymous with scandal. They sold the mansion at a loss to a tech billionaire who gutted it. They moved to a smaller, gated community in Florida, disappearing from the world they had once ruled with an iron fist. I heard from Sylvia that my father spent his days playing golf with other disgraced executives. A king in a kingdom of has-beens. I didn't use the $42 million to buy a mansion or a fleet of sports cars. The thought of it almost made me laugh. After living on nothing for so long, extravagance felt alien, almost vulgar. My grandfather had called the money a tool, and that's how I decided to use it. A tool, not a trophy. I set up a charitable trust to manage the bulk of the estate, with Sylvia as the trustee, focusing on arts education for underprivileged youth. Then, I took a small portion and bought a beautiful, run-down old brick warehouse in the city's burgeoning arts district. It had been a textile mill 100 years ago. It had high, vaulted ceilings with exposed beams, huge, grime-covered industrial windows, and enough space to breathe, to create, to build. I spent 6 months renovating it, not by hiring expensive contractors, but by doing most of the work myself. I wanted to feel the transformation in my own hands. I learned to lay floors, to run electrical wiring, to patch acres of drywall. The physical labor was cleansing. With every swing of a hammer, every coat of fresh white paint that covered the old brick, I felt like I was building my future and knocking down the walls of my past. I kept a small, private loft for myself on the top floor, a simple space with a bed, a kitchen, and a single, perfect view of the city skyline. The entire main floor, a vast, light-filled expanse, became the Sterling Arts Collective. It wasn't a gallery in the traditional, stuffy sense. It was a living, breathing organism. I used the money to set up a dozen subsidized studios for young, struggling artists who were in the same position I had been in for over a decade, brimming with talent but desperately short on cash. The place came alive almost overnight. It was filled with the sounds of creation, the splash of paint, the whir of a potter's wheel, the hiss of a welding torch, the lively chatter of artists debating color theory over cheap coffee. It was messy, chaotic, and the most beautiful thing I had ever been a part of. We weren't just artists sharing a space. We were a community, a chosen family forged in creativity. I had a new friend, an older sculptor named Maria, who had a laugh like a thunderstorm and gave brutally honest critiques that always made my work better. I didn't just fund the place. I was its heart. My own studio was in the back corner, the largest one, open to anyone who wanted to wander in. I painted every day. My work had changed. The anger and grief were still there, deep in the underlayers of the canvas, but they were no longer the only colors on my palette. There was hope now, and light, and a sense of hard-won peace that I hadn't known was possible. One afternoon, I was in the middle of a large canvas, a chaotic abstract of deep, turbulent blues and brilliant, explosive golds. I was lost in it, in the push and pull of the colors, when Maria's apprentice, a fiery 14-year-old girl named Maya, came up to me. She was a fantastically gifted sculptor who was afraid of nothing. "Hey, Alex," she said, wiping a smudge of clay on her already filthy jeans. "You got a minute? For you? Always?" I said, putting my brush down. She pointed a clay-caked finger at my canvas. "It looks like a storm," she said, her head tilted. "But like a happy storm, like thunder and lightning, but at a party." I laughed out loud. "That's exactly what it is." Cool, she said. Hey, some old guy is here. He wants to see you. Says he's an art critic or something. Looks kinda grumpy. My heart did a little flip. I knew who it was before she even finished. Julian Croft, the most influential and feared art critic in the state. Years ago, when I was at my lowest, desperate for a break, I had spent my last $50 to submit my portfolio to him. His assistant sent back a curt form letter with a handwritten note at the bottom. Lacks maturity. Too much raw emotion. Not enough technical discipline. It had crushed me at the time. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked out to the main floor. There he was, an imposing man with a shock of white hair and severe black glasses, studying a powerful, raw sculpture Maya had just finished. He saw me approach. His eyes, sharp and analytical, swept over me. Alexander Sterling, he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was gravelly, like stones being turned over. Mr. Croft, I replied, meeting his gaze and shaking his hand. His grip was firm. I remember your work from years ago, he said, getting straight to the point. No small talk. It was loud, unfocused. I had a lot to shout about back then, I said with a small smile. He grunted, which I took as a sign of agreement. He spent the next hour walking through the collective, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't just glance at the work. He studied it, getting up close, walking around the sculptures, occasionally asking a sharp question about an artist's technique or influence. Finally, he came to my studio space in the back. He stood for a long, silent time in front of my Happy Storm painting. This is still loud, he said at last, his eyes tracing the thick, impasto lines of gold I had woven through the turbulent blue. But now you know what you're saying. You're conducting the orchestra instead of just screaming with it. He turned to leave, then paused at the entrance to my space. What you're doing here, he said, gesturing to the entire humming workshop. This is important. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. He left shortly after that. I didn't think much more of it. The visit itself, his quiet words of approval, were validation enough. A week later, his influential Sunday art column came out. Maria brought me the paper, a huge grin on her face. The headline was, "The Rebirth of a Sterling: How a Disgraced Name is Forging a New, More Valuable Legacy in Art." He wrote about the collective, about the raw, explosive talent we were nurturing. And then he wrote about me. He wrote, "Sterling's own work is the heart of this place. It is a testament to the kintsugi philosophy, the Japanese art of finding profound beauty in the broken places. He has taken the shards of a painful past and has not hidden the cracks, but has illuminated them with shimmering gold. It is more than technique. It is truth. It is the work of a man who has been to hell and returned, not with souvenirs, but with a map for the rest of us." I read the article 3 times, the newsprint blurring through my tears. It wasn't my father's approval. It wasn't the fawning of the art world's elite. It was a quiet, respected acknowledgement from a man who judged the work, not the name. It was the kind of recognition my grandfather had always wanted for me. That evening, I was sorting through a box of old things from my pre-inheritance life that I hadn't had the heart to throw away. At the bottom was a small, sealed box. Inside were all the letters my grandfather had ever sent me. And underneath them was one more letter, one I hadn't seen before. It was from my mother. Sylvia had forwarded it to me months ago, and I had never opened it. My first instinct was to throw it away unread. But the man who read that art review was not the same man who had walked out of that courtroom 18 months ago. I was stronger now. I was whole. I opened it. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a plea for money. It was just sad. A rambling, disjointed account of her empty days in Florida. She wrote about the oppressive humidity. She wrote about the other people in her gated community. She wrote about how quiet the house was. She never mentioned my father or Emma or the trial. It was the letter of a woman adrift in a world she didn't recognize, a ghost in her own life. I read it, and I felt a pang of something, not forgiveness, but a distant, sorrowful empathy. She was a product of the gilded cage she had helped build, and now she was trapped inside it, alone. I folded the letter and put it back in the box with my grandfather's things. I closed the lid. The past was the past. It was a part of my story, a part of the kintsugi gold that traced the lines of my life, but it was not my home. My home was here, in this noisy, paint-splattered warehouse, under a happy storm of blue and gold. Today, the Sterling Arts Collective is thriving. It's a symphony of beautiful, creative noise. The air always smells of wet clay from the pottery studio, the sharp tang of oil paint and turpentine, the hot metal scent from the welder's corner, and the constant, comforting aroma of brewing coffee. My life isn't quiet, but it is peaceful, a kind of deep, resonant peace I never knew existed. This afternoon, I was working with one of my youngest students, a quiet, talented young man named Leo. We were at the kintsugi station, a corner of the workshop I had set up that was dedicated to the ancient Japanese art of repair. Leo, in a moment of frustration with another piece, had accidentally knocked a beautiful ceramic bowl he'd spent weeks crafting off a shelf. It had shattered on the concrete floor. He was devastated, on the verge of tears. "It's ruined," he said, his voice thick with disappointment as he looked at the pieces in his hands. "All that work, it's just garbage now." "No, it's not," I told him gently, sitting down beside him. "It's not ruined. It's just ready for the next step." I showed him how to carefully, patiently piece the fragments back together, like a three-dimensional puzzle. I showed him how to mix the traditional lacquer with powdered gold, creating a shimmering, precious adhesive. I guided his hand as he traced the lines of the break, not as a scar to be hidden, but as a feature to be celebrated, a part of the bowl's unique history. "You see," I said, as he applied the final, shimmering gold line. "The cracks don't make it weaker. They're a record of its journey. They tell its story. They're what make it unique. In a way, it's more beautiful now, for having been broken." He looked at the mended bowl, turning it over and over in his hands, watching how the light caught the golden seams. A slow, wondrous smile spread across his face. In his eyes, I saw a reflection of my own long, painful, and ultimately beautiful journey of repair. Later, after everyone had gone home for the day and the workshop had fallen into a rare, comfortable silence, I stood alone in my studio. The late afternoon sun streamed through the massive industrial windows, casting long, dramatic shadows across the floor and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny stars. My gaze fell upon the far wall of my studio. Hanging there, in a simple, elegant frame made from reclaimed wood, wasn't one of my paintings. It was a single piece of paper, yellowed with age, its creases softened over time. It was a note from my grandfather, the one he had given me with the key all those years ago. His handwriting, a beautiful, strong script, was as clear and powerful as the day I first read it. "Make something they can't erase." I looked from his words to the world I had built around me. The art, the community, the lives that were being changed here every day, including, and especially, my own. I had taken the ugliest parts of my life, the rejection, the betrayal, the attempted erasure, and with the tool my grandfather had given me, I had built something real, something with heart, something that would last long after I was gone. My father had tried to burn my inheritance to ash. Instead, all he did was light the fire that forged the rest of my life. I am no longer a Sterling by name, not in the way they understood it. My legacy isn't written in a stock portfolio or on a corporate letterhead. It's here, in the golden cracks of a mended bowl, in the happy storm of a finished painting, in the enduring truth that the most valuable things in this world are the ones we create from the broken pieces of who we were. And that is a legacy no one can ever take away. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it resonated with you in some way. Have you ever had to fight to be seen for who you truly are? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And please, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. At the will reading, Grandpa's lawyer handed me a $42 million check. My father snatched it, lit a match, and watched it burn. I didn't protest. I just smiled. What they destroyed was actually, I'm Alex. I'm 32 years old, and my own parents had me legally declared dead to steal my inheritance. Before I tell you how I used my grandfather's last gift to expose them in a packed courtroom, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. It all started on a Tuesday, one of those gray, drizzly Tuesdays in October where the world just feels a little bit heavy. I was sitting in a lawyer's office that smelled of old books and expensive coffee. The chair was leather, probably worth more than my entire apartment, and it creaked every time I shifted my weight. The air was thick with a tension so profound it felt like a physical presence. Across the polished mahogany table sat my family, or the people who were biologically related to me. My father, Richard, sat ramrod straight, his perfectly tailored suit a kind of armor. His face, which I inherited in fragments, was a mask of bored impatience. Beside him, my mother, Eleanor, her pearls gleaming against her black dress, her posture impeccable. She radiated a chillingly serene disapproval. And my sister, Emma, a little younger than me, was utterly absorbed in her phone, her thumb flicking endlessly upwards. She had perfected the art of being present and absent at the same time. We were there for the reading of my grandfather's will. Arthur Sterling. His name alone carried weight in this city. He was the only one who ever really saw me, the only one who looked past the Sterling name and saw the boy who liked to draw in the margins of his notebooks. He was the patriarch, the man who built the Sterling and Son Holdings empire from nothing. I hadn't wanted to come. 13 years of silence and a carefully curated absence had been my shield. Being in this room felt like tearing off a scar. But I had made a promise to Grandpa on one of his last good days. "You be there, Alex," he'd rasped, his hand, thin and papery, gripping mine with surprising strength. "Promise me, you have to be there." So I was a ghost at the feast. The lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in her 50s named Sylvia Orton, finally cleared her throat, bringing the silent room to attention. She had a no-nonsense air about her that I appreciated. She began reading through the usual bequests in a calm, measured tone. A vintage Patek Philippe watch to my father, who glanced at his own Rolex as if comparing them. A collection of first-edition novels to my mother, who would undoubtedly display them but never read them. To Emma, the family's sprawling vacation cabin on the lake and a vintage Martin guitar she'd once coveted. My family nodded along, their faces masks of practiced solemnity. This was all going according to their script. Then Sylvia paused. The rustling of paper stopped. She looked up from the document, and her eyes, sharp and intelligent, found mine across the table. She held my gaze for a beat too long, a silent message passing between us that I didn't yet understand. "And finally," she said, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the stale air, "to my beloved grandson Alexander Sterling, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including all controlling shares in Sterling and Son Holdings, valued at $42 million. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air out of the room. My mother's hand flew to her pearls, a gesture of shock that was, for once, completely genuine. Emma's head snapped up from her phone, her mouth slightly agape. My father just stared. The mask of bored authority shattered, and his face cycled through a Rolodex of emotions. Disbelief, confusion, and then a deep, dangerous, blotchy red. That's impossible," he sputtered, his voice a strangled whisper. "It's a mistake." Sylvia didn't flinch. "The document is ironclad, Richard." She reached into a folder and pulled out a cashier's check, sliding it across the polished table toward me. My name was printed on it in bold, black ink. Alexander Sterling, $42 million. The numbers seemed to float off the page, unreal. I didn't move, couldn't. I was paralyzed by the sheer gravitational pull of the moment. But my father could move. He shot out of his chair so fast it screeched against the floorboards, a sound of pure rage. He lunged across the table, his cufflinks scratching the perfect mahogany, and snatched the check before my fingers could even graze it. Then he did something I will never, ever forget. He pulled a gold-plated lighter from his pocket, the one Grandpa had given him for his 40th birthday, flicked it on, and held the flame to the corner of the $42 million check. The corner blackened, curled, and caught. The flame greedily ate its way across the paper, turning my name, my future, into a fragile, glowing ember. My mother, in a synchronized act of vicious destruction, grabbed the thick envelope next to it, the final letter from my grandfather, and began tearing it into tiny, furious pieces, letting them flutter onto the table like bitter confetti. They both looked at me then, their eyes blazing with a unified, triumphant hatred. They were waiting for me to scream, to cry, to lunge at them as he had lunged for the check. They wanted a reaction. They wanted to see me break. But I didn't. I just sat there, watching the last physical proof of my inheritance turn to smoke, and I smiled. A small, quiet, knowing smile, because Grandpa had told me this would happen. He knew his son. He knew his family. And this bonfire on a lawyer's desk was only the opening act. What they thought was their final victory was just the beginning of their end. To understand that smile, you have to understand the 13 years of silence that came before it. You have to go back to a dinner table that felt less like a family gathering and more like a corporate boardroom where I was the failing investment, about to be liquidated. I was 19, a sophomore in business school, dutifully walking the path my father had paved for me before I could even spell balance sheet. The Son in Sterling and Son.